Well, hello and welcome to today's special event, the Current and Future State of Interoperability. I'm Carol Flagg of Answers Media Network and Healthcare Now Radio. Thanks for joining in. On this 75-minute event, our moderator and panelists will discuss the current and future path to full interoperability from three angles: legislative, technical, and financial. This event is produced and hosted by Answers Media Network, that's me, and Healthcare Now Radio, that's also me. Answers Media Network publishes a series of topic-driven websites and multimedia channels dedicated to covering current issues and federal initiatives driving change in healthcare delivery. Our internet radio station, Healthcare Now Radio, averages 25,000 listeners per month. Learn more at any of our websites. Today's event is made possible by the sponsorship of Medicomp Systems. Medicomp Systems' flagship engine, Medicomp's Quip, offers a suite of solutions that delivers longitudinal patient information within problem-oriented clinical views, mirroring the way physicians think and work to drive optimal patient outcomes. Quip seamlessly integrates into existing clinical workflows and any EHR to enable health systems to further enhance EHR usability. Today, leading hospitals and health systems and more than 100,000 users per day rely on Medicomp's expertise and clinician design technology to improve the quality and efficiency of care delivery. For more information, please visit them online at www.medicomp.com. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator and panelists for today's discussion. David Harlow is a well-known face and voice to our events, having moderated many of them. He is a healthcare lawyer and consultant with over 30 years of public and private sector experience. His focus is on digital health law and policy, working with covered entities and business associates, including healthcare providers, big data analytics, shops, and health app developers on the complex issues around HIPAA and data privacy and security planning. He is also host of Harlow on Healthcare, which airs on our own Healthcare Now radio station, and writes the award-winning blog, Health Blog. You can follow him on Twitter, of course, at Health Blog and at Harlow on HC. And now I'll introduce our panelists. Jitin Asnaani is the Executive Director of CommonWell Health Alliance. At CommonWell, he is charged with stewarding the organization's mission of building a scalable infrastructure that enables health data to follow the patient regardless of where their care occurs. Prior to CommonWell, Jitin was a director at Athena Health, where he focused on building the company's cloud-based interoperability platform and represented the company on federal advisory committees, including CommonWell Health Alliance, the Argonaut Project, and Direct Trust. Follow him on Twitter at Jitin and at CommonWell. Chuck Christian is a longtime advocate for applying health IT to improve patient care. He is Vice President of Technology and Engagement at the Indiana Health Information Exchange, which operates the nation's largest interorganizational clinical data repository, and he's a current Vice Chair of CHIME's Policy Steering Committee. In addition, he was a member of CHIME's Board of Directors between 2002 and 2004, chaired the CHIME Board of Directors in 2015, and chaired CHIME's Foundation Board of Directors in 2016. Follow him on Twitter at ChazChristian and Indiana HIE. David Lareau is the CEO of Medicomp Systems, where he's responsible for operations and product management, including customer relations and marketing. Prior to joining Medicomp, Dave founded a company that installed management communications networks in large enterprises such as the World Bank, DuPont, and Sinai Hospital in Baltimore. His work at Sinai led to the founding of a medical billing company that led, in turn, to his partnership with Medicomp. You can follow the company on Twitter at MedicompSys. And last but by no means least is Chris Muir, Director, Standards Division at the ONC. Chris joined the ONC in January 2007 and has worked in state and federal government for over 25 years. Prior to his current position at the ONC, he was a director for the State Health Information Exchange Cooperative Agreement Program, in which the ONC awarded over $500 million in grants to enable health information exchange in each state. Previous to the ONC, Chris was the Strategic Projects Manager for the State of Arizona CIO's office. You can follow the ONC on Twitter at ONC_HealthIT. And now I'll turn today's discussion over to our moderator, David Harlow.
Welcome, everyone. Well, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is that this is our third annual panel discussion on current and future state of interoperability. The bad news is that this is our third annual panel discussion on the current and future state of interoperability. If we had achieved interoperability, we wouldn't be talking about it anymore, would we, gentlemen? There's obviously still a lot of work to do. We've certainly made strides. There's certainly been progress over the past several years, but there's still a long way to go. CHIME put out a survey last month, I believe, sort of taking a snapshot perspective on interoperability from CIOs, and the view is sort of a combination glass half full, glass half empty kind of perspective. I mean, we've certainly made great strides. We've collectively spent a lot of money, put in a lot of effort on this objective, and there's certainly a lot to show for it, but there's still certainly a long way to go. Just one thing that stood out for me in the CHIME survey was almost all facilities, all hospitals say that they're able to send along a record of what happened in the hospital when a patient goes back into the community. They can send that information to the community-based physician. Only about 2/3 of hospitals were able to assimilate that same sort of information from physicians. Now, obviously it needs to be a two-way street, and to add another layer to that, the question is always, does the patient get a view of all this information as well? Now, in the coming year, that's going to be a requirement that a hospital has to deliver a record of an admission to a patient upon discharge. Right now, we're still at the 30-day level requirement, and that is often observed in the breach, quite honestly, from what I hear from the field, so to speak, and so we clearly have a long way to go. The value of interoperability is not only at the individual patient and clinician level, of course, but in terms of promoting greater population health. And hopefully we can get into some of that today and thinking about how do these tools really get us to the next level in terms of health of populations, because ultimately that is sort of the value inherent in these tools. Yes, of course, we can make individual clinical encounters better, faster, cheaper, more effective, more appropriate, and all that good stuff. But ultimately, the value of the technology that we are all investing in so heavily is going to be improving health across populations. So today we stand between a number of different sets of rules and other issuances from government agencies. Some have come out for the year of 2018, some have yet to come out for 2018. And we're all waiting with bated breath, and hopefully they're not going to be the 5 p.m. on a Friday kind of regulation drops that sometimes we get used to over time. But we are moving now from meaningful use to the new locution of promoting interoperability. So promoting interoperability, again, is the new name for the sets of incentives that are in place for what we used to call meaningful use. And these incentives and these standards have been streamlined tremendously this year versus past years in order to make these easier to achieve for the provider community. And I guess that sort of begs the question, is the goal to make this easier to achieve for the provider community, or is the goal to push or pull the provider community, kicking and screaming if necessary, into the future? So there's the promoting interoperability rule, and then there are these things that we're waiting for, which is the 21st Century Cures Act regulation on interoperability and the TEFCA framework, the security framework that we're waiting to see finalized this year. And I'd like to kick things off by asking the panelists to weigh in on sort of expectations for where these new rules and frameworks may be leading us in the coming year, where you would like to have them lead us in the coming year, or in fact, whether we are already there and whether the rules need to conform to the lived experience and the development of private sector standards as opposed to the other way around. And not to put you on the spot, but Jitin, I want to start off with you because I think that is definitely in your wheelhouse because of the work that your organization has done with others in moving us further along the path to interoperability.
Absolutely. So as I think about these sets of rules, the thing that strikes me, number one is that they are all different rules. They're complementary rules, and they're driving towards a common vision. What I really appreciated about, if you recall from those who did enjoy the full text of the draft TEFCA rule that came out earlier this year, a notion about
it was gripping.
It was gripping, absolutely. I could not put it down. Well, actually, I literally could not.
I had hair beforehand.
One thing they mentioned, and there was this notion that the private sector has made progress, is making progress, and they don't want to damage what the, from the ONC perspective, at least articulated in that rule. There's a desire not to damage what the industry is already doing. My perspective on it, to be as succinct as I can, is that those rules are necessary. They do two things. There's for any industry adoption curve, there are those at the front and there are those at the back, and I'm not sure if this gets reversed when you put this on a webcam. And the function of a rule there can be to really pull up everybody, everybody who's been held behind for reasons of perception, reasons of just being frozen in time. And so there's a value to the rules on that front. On the other hand, there's also just this notion that interoperability, this is your third annual webinar on interoperability, and there is a lot more work to be done. And even at the work we see happening out in the industry, there are varying levels of quality, even in a number of the initiatives that, for example, CommonWell has participated in or collaborations we're involved in. The notion of what exactly does it mean for interoperability to happen is tremendously variable, and we see it within our community and with outside communities all the time. And to the extent that there's an opportunity to guide the industry towards what interoperability means and what interoperability could be, it's a fine balance, but there's actually a place for rulemaking and guidance and policy issuing in that context to kind of bring the entire industry to a place where you can look at it and say, yep, that's interoperability, that was valuable, that makes sense for us to do, which is not the case today.
So, Chris, I'd like to bring you into the discussion to hear what you have to say about sort of where we've been, where we may be going on the rulemaking front. I know there's limited amounts of what you can say about the future in that regard, but can you give us sort of the trajectory that we're on?
Yeah, so and then thank you for that question. And as you indicated, there's not a lot I can say, but I think going back to 21st Century Cures, which is driving a lot of what is going to be in the rulemaking, and starting off by talking about TEF, the Trusted Exchange Framework that was referenced. And as Jitin mentioned, there's a lot that's already going on out in the marketplace. There are local health information exchanges that are taking place. There are state-based exchanges, and there's also national. And some of these are private networks that are being implemented, and some of them are public. And so I think the goal of Cures and the goal of the TEF that was identified in Cures is really to be able to engage the networks with each other and make sure that data can flow between each other. Because what we saw, especially in certain marketplaces, if a provider wanted to exchange data with other providers, they might end up having to join several networks, and that just doesn't help, and it's not efficient. When we're trying to get nationwide interoperability and nationwide exchange. I will also have to say that from an ONC perspective, there are several things that were in 21st Century Cures that will be somewhat addressed in some of the the rules that will be coming out. Under interoperability efforts, one of the things that was in CURES was the promotion of open APIs so that people, end users, can have access without any special effort. There's the whole info blocking that will be addressed within the rules. Keeping O&C, not only are we to certify products, but we're also supposed to be looking at the business practices of software developers now and making sure that they're transparent in what they're doing and that they don't have business practices that block data flow. We already talked about TEFCA related stuff, and then there's also the promotion of patient access, and there's a lot of things that that the 21st Century CURES asked us to address with OCR, things like patient education and some other policy things. And so that, without going into any detail, that kind of gives you a flavor of the kinds of things that are being worked on.
Right. Now, from the patient perspective, some patient advocates are vocally complaining about the notion that some of the measures are pared back, really in response to provider issues with having compliance with certain measures being out of their control. Dave, to bring you into the conversation, I'm wondering if you could say something about how you see the measures and standards sort of working in the field. Do we have sets of rules and measures and anticipated rules that are workable in the field, or are we still at the stage where we need a million workarounds? We were talking a moment ago about having to have multiple systems that maybe don't communicate directly with each other. How far along are we in that evolution?
Well, I think for the meantime, you're going to have multiple workarounds. Jitin said something very interesting. He said that, he didn't say this directly, but sort of implied that the rules kind of set the floor for what the industry needs to do. And you need to, when you're setting regulations and rules, know a couple of things. Most of the patient data, other than at the payer level, most of the patient data is locked up and owned by the enterprises or the physician's office, the people delivering care. They are going to do the minimum they need to do. This includes the vendors of those enterprises and the enterprises themselves. They're going to do the minimum they need to do to meet whatever regulation is done. I think meaningful use proved that out. We ended up having to, as an industry, pare down our expectations because we were getting so much pushback from the enterprises and the provider community. So whatever rules are set are going to set the minimum. The only way to increase it beyond that, and this will go into a later part of this topic, I'm sure, David, you're going to get to that, but you have to align the financial incentives and penalties with the minimal expectations that people need. And if you want them to do more, they're going to ask, who's paying for all this effort? Because as you mentioned at the beginning, David, in your introduction, as an industry, we've spent a lot of money so far on this, and we've built pipes, we've built frameworks, we've built nodes, but we haven't really achieved interoperability because most of the people out in the field who need to do the work are going to do the minimum that they have to do to meet whatever regulation is met.
Right. So, Chuck, from your perspective, do you see some movement in the direction of useful interoperability without these final rules in place yet? There are these private sector standards and systems that have been put into place, and I'm wondering, again, from your perspective, if you see those as working, or is the information too static, or is the transfer of information unidirectional when it needs to be bidirectional and more dynamic, or how do you see the current state?
Well, I'll have to be careful since you're recording this because it'll come back to get me. Jitin's is smiling. He and I have been on a panel before. The thing about it is I think that one of the things that disturbs me is we have this term called interoperability, and it means so many different things. If you look at some of the use cases that are out there now, when some people talk about interoperability, they're only talking about exchanging a CCD down to the next level of care. Well, there are so many other things and use cases around this thing called interoperability that, or how do you really get to the data to make sure that it's meaningful to whoever needs it at that point in time. I'll give you a couple of other use cases. If you're an ACO, getting a CCD on that patient is not very helpful. Knowing that your patient population was in the emergency room last night, or had a visit at another hospital yesterday, so you can intervene to help move them back into your network, that's important. But that's really not talked about as being interoperability, but it does help move the financial incentives from one location to the next, because until we start looking at some of the advanced payment models and some of the at-risk models, access to the data, it was kind of passé. People really, it's whatever the doctors wanted, whatever the nurses wanted. It really wasn't a business issue. But now that it's become useful in patient management, for population management, for research, and trying to do predictive analysis on top of those things, it's very important for us to look beyond that typical, let's just send a summary of care document to the primary care physician after the patient is discharged. So in the other, I'm a policy wonk, sitting on the CHIME policy committee for decades. And the other thing is, David, this may be your third panel, but I've been doing interoperability in Indiana as a CIO since 2005. So I am really a slow learner, to tell you the truth. So, I was a customer of this exchange for many years before I joined the company. But there's at least 3 different policy levers that I think that we need to have some serious conversation about. And if you want to add 42 CFR Part 2, that makes 4. One of them is a way to positively identify the patients. Is that if we're going to exchange data and let the data follow the patient, even the folks at SureScripts and that have record locator services like Jitin has, identifying those patients in the different markets that they have, the different care settings, is very, very difficult. I've got a couple of stories for myself. My name is really not common, but I've been misidentified on more than one occasion. And the other one is, if you look about moving data, I worked at a hospital that was a border facility. We service patients in Indiana and Illinois. There are different consent models. There are different privacy models in those states. If you are sitting in Pennsylvania and you're seeing patients from New York, you have a problem, because New York is an opt-in state, Pennsylvania is an opt-out state. And so being able to move that data appropriately, the folks in New York have said, well, we can receive data, but we can't share data unless that patient specifically, opts in to share the data. And then, the VA recently made a change to their consent model as well, so they can share. So there are some policy levers that we can help use as all for this thing called interoperability. But we need to look at the broader use cases. I mean, I've got a clinical background, and my wife was a critical care nurse, and we had friends that were, the PAT nurses, the nurses who are gathering up information for patients before they have surgery. That's a hard task to gather up everything that the anesthesiologist is going to want to see, particularly if the patient didn't have that test or that service done at your facility. So making that data available to that nurse speeds along the prep for the information package that she needs to share for that clinician or even the surgeon to make sure they have all the I's dotted and the T's crossed. And so I think that we're doing a lot. It reminds me of something my dad always told me: if it's easy, anybody could do it. And the other thing that a lot of people believe that you can pick one of the interoperability options and it's going to do everything you want it to do. having been at 2 hospitals and done interoperability differently in both organizations, I'll tell you that's not the case. It's going to have to use an and scenario rather than an or scenario.
Right, right. So are we at a point now where there is a particular technical standard? Dave, I'll put you on the hot seat here and ask, is there a particular standard? I mean, we all talk about FHIR, we talk about other standards, other approaches to interoperability. Is there one standard that is going to be the single solution, or do we need to think more broadly in terms of goals and in terms of types of data as opposed to a single technical standard for sharing information?
Well, I think a technical standard for sharing information like FHIR is important to have a mechanism to initiate and complete the exchange. The real challenge for interoperability is going to be, what does the person receiving it, what are they able to do with it? Do they just get dumped a bunch of stuff, CCD, a bunch of headers with text in it, etc.? And I think that's where, in 2003, the NCVHS Standards Committee declared some voluntary standard clinical terminologies: SNOMED, LOINC, RX norm. Right there you have problems, you have meds, you have labs, you have some really important things. But if you go to many sites, there's no requirement that they're mapped to LOINC for labs. Most of them are mapped to RX norm or something very similar, NDC codes, to get prescriptions written through SureScripts, and most of them code, diagnoses in ICD-10 or SNOMED. But there needs to be, you need to be able to receive the information through the exchange mechanism, and then, Don Rucker has 4 things that he says we got to be able to do. We got to be able to send, we got to be able to receive, we got to be able to find it, and we've got to be able to integrate it into our workflows. That's going to take a separate set of data standards, because if you open the envelope, whatever it is, it used to be HL7, maybe now it's FHIR, when you open that envelope on the receiving end and a bunch of stuff pours out, and you got to figure out what it is and do it, it's not going to work. It's not going to achieve what we call clinical interoperability. You've got to be able to receive the data, know the format, know what it is, and then be able to somehow intelligently filter it and find the things, say, related to this patient's diabetes or renal failure, et cetera, the set of labs, the set of meds, et cetera. And to do that, you need data. I don't think we're going to get there anytime soon by sending text and relying on natural language processing to find that stuff for us. There's going to be too high of an error rate. So right. You need another level of standards, and you need to provide some mechanism for those standards and some either incentive or penalty if you don't. And you can't code everything in a record, so you have to have some sort of exception handling on both the sending and receiving end. I think that'll give you what we call real clinical interoperability, so the receiver can do the 4 things that Don Rucker says they need to do: send it, receive it, find it, and make use of it in their workflows.
Right. So are we just at the we're just at the end of the beginning? It sounds like, where if we have these rules that come out by the end of this year, we may have achieved interoperability at the envelope level, but not at the content level. Are we looking at the contents level interoperability? Jitin, you have thoughts on that? What's next? What's next year's project if we get to a point where we have interoperable envelopes?
That's, I love Dave's remarks on that front. So I love the requote as well of Dr. Don Rucker's sort of 4 tenets here: the find, send, receive, and then incorporate. And I think you could say that there's between TEFCA, between the work that the national networks, the state and regional networks are doing, the local networks are doing, we have a pretty good handle on how do you do send and receive. I think one of the things that we personally at CommonWell at least look forward to in TEFCA is this notion of find is is not industry standard at this point. You know, we've implemented it, others have implemented it in sort of local and state levels. But this notion that I can actually find out where the patient's been, I can find out where their record is so that I can then do a send receive is not broadly, that is part of the floor that that Dave is correct. I kind of implied there that needs to be seen. On that front of incorporate it, actually get the data and actually do things with it. I think that is where a lot of, at least from my perspective, that is actually where a lot of the work lies now. And it's funny, right? Because we've been talking about content for a decade or more, right? Since before HitSP and HitC and way before high tech. Halfway through Chuck's career, this became a big issue that lots of people were working on. Take a stab at my mentor up there. There's a lot that's been discussed, and now we have new alternatives. We have things like FHIR, which promise discrete data elements that you can actually work with. For those who are following the work that CommonWell Carrier Quality did, we published in conjunction with the Argonaut project a joint document quality workgroup report that actually it gives you a better implementation of the CCDA. It guides you how, for example, you can pull in notes into the CCDA, which is a huge part of the content that's not exchanged today, that is extremely important from both the provider and patient and other perspectives too, as payers and others get plugged into data exchange per the TEF. All of them are going to find it valuable. So, David, to answer your question, I actually think that is the coming frontier of interoperable work. And this, to be clear, this is Zeno's arrow, right? You get there, you nail down data that works, that people know how to look at and understand, and can look at from one EHR to the next EHR and know exactly what they're looking at. Now you ask yourself, well, how am I supposed to know when these things should result in a particular type of action? What action should they give me an opportunity to take at that moment? How can you actually not just give me the information I want when I'm about to do something, but before I'm about to do something? There's a lot you can continue doing. Interoperability, there'll always be work to be done. But the current clear kind of frontier is on the content itself. And to that end, there are actually, thankfully, no lack of things that we can do. This work that we did with Carrier Quality is just a nice demonstration that it is actually possible to get 14 of the largest EHR vendors in the industry to sit down and agree on a single CCDA implementation guide, which, by the way, we would never have been able to do if ONC hadn't required the CCDA for Meaningful Use Stage 2. As not so awesome as that document was, and I take full blame for it. I led that project when I was at ONC. The reality is it gave us a place now to start to actually bring this industry together, and we can bring the industry together to make a better document. But we don't have to stop there either, right? I mean, who says that an implementation guide is really worth anything anyway? The beauty now is you have these things like CommonWell, you have all our state and local HIEs, you have eHealth Exchange, you even have Carrier Quality to some extent, but it's not a network but a framework. And all of these organizations have the ability to do some amount of potentially enforcement, at the least monitoring of the kind of data that's flowing on them. So they have the opportunity to help the entire industry, or at least their large silos or subsets in the industry, to actually be able to determine what is quality of data that's moving across the line? What is the content? Does it include everything that we would expect it to? What percentage of the time do we have labs in there? What percentage of the times are the problems, allergies, meds in there? Are they all formatted the same way? Lots of questions, lots of kind of silly syntactic questions that we still can't answer today on a day-to-day basis from one exchange to the next, which we can do systematically across the entire healthcare network with a little bit of work. But it's not 5 years now. I'm looking at 1 year, 2 years, where we can do this systematically across the entire healthcare landscape. And then there'll still be work to do on the semantics. And then there'll still be the work to do on the kind of the decision support. And then there'll still be work to do on how do you make this ever, evolve with whatever it is doctors 3 years from now are using as their technology platform for taking care of patients. But I feel like we're in a really good spot to follow exactly what we discussed there.
Yeah. You in your comments you mentioned care equality as an example. You drew a distinction between a network and a framework, and I wanted to ask you to expand on that.
Sure. A network is a organization which typically has a common agreement among its members that enable a sort of a similar agreed upon, the same agreed upon set of policies for standard security, privacy, and the like, as well as a technological capability to connect to each of those members and enable exchange from one to the other without the need for participants in that network to do point-to-point connections. And that's the way a network works. And networks can enable different types of exchange. In our case, it's specifically record locator service based exchange of data. Carry quality, and really I wish my friend Dave Castle were here to speak of it. He'll do a much better job, obviously. But carry quality is a framework. There's a common agreement to which all the participating networks agree to enable them to be able to connect to each other one-to-one. There is a great bit of work you can do to make it easier for them to connect one-to-one. For example, an agreed-upon set of fairly constrained standards. But ultimately, it is point-to-point connectivity, which means there's some things you can do and some things you cannot. One of the things you cannot really do, one thing you can do is to have minimal infrastructure. One thing you cannot do is do things like network monitoring or brokering exchange from one participant to the other, because all of these things require you to have some amount of capability, technological capability, in the midst of all the players, which a framework cannot do. As sort of the con side of its equation, where again the other side is it's easier to set up, put up, and maintain over time.
Okay. Right. Chris, one of the things that came across in part of our recent conversation here is the notion of having a system that will surface suggestions or recommendations to a clinician. And I know the Federal Trade Commission has started to work on looking at how one regulates or approves an artificial intelligence sort of algorithm, where it's sort of a black box. It's a learning algorithm and may evolve over time. And I'm wondering if you've given some thought to this in your agency, and sort of whether there's something you can tell us about perspective on AI from the regulator's perch.
From the regulator's perch, we are looking at the innovators to see what they're coming up with, and there's a lot of things going on in regards to AI. We see a lot of things happening with things like radiology. They're able to take with machine learning and deep learning and be able to do a lot of creative things. There's a lot of other things going on with reading doctors' notes and be able to glean information out of there. So right now, I think for the most part we're at a wait and see kind of perspective. We don't want to stop innovation. Of course, we need to protect the public's interest, but our role at ONC is very limited on the regulatory part of it, and we're taking more of a wait and see perspective on it.
Mm-hmm. Chuck and Dave, do you see the use of AI in healthcare technology as something that will perpetually go hand in hand with human interaction, with clinicians using the tools, or at some point do we reach that stage where the machine can do it all?
I'll let Dave answer, because I want to give you a history lesson when Dave finishes.
Okay, I think we're a long time away from trusting something to the black box algorithms that Chris just mentioned. I do believe that artificial intelligence techniques and algorithms can find relevant data in a record. I mean, we do it now and say, find the information that I'm worried about this patient's renal status. Find the information in their record that might explain it, might help me determine the seriousness of it, help me determine if it's getting better or worse, etc. Because out of the 360,000 or so data points in a true clinical database, there's probably about 400 or 500 which are highly relevant to renal failure, and AI techniques can help surface that for the clinician. But then the clinician has to look at it and say, is this new, different, or unchanged? Are there where to come from? Are there sequelae I have to worry about? Are there complications? So AI can be very valuable in filtering and presenting information, but at this point, we believe the clinician still needs to be there to take a look at it. For very single point decisions like this person in AFib from a watch, you can probably detect that, but you still don't know why they're in AFib or why they're having some arrhythmia. And so you need clinical thinking to do that, but artificial intelligence and other algorithms can surface information for the clinician definitely and make their time with the patient more effective. We do believe that, even now. Chuck?
Well, I was just going to say, you reminded me of a quote that John Halemka said, that if a physician can be replaced by the computer, he needs to be. Let me give you a history lesson. Jitin said I've been around for a long time, and I have. My stint of computers in healthcare goes back to the 70s when I was trying to automate radiology departments when it was very, very expensive. But it's the really interesting. I'm going to poke at Chris just a little bit and hope he won't hold it against me when I see him in Washington D.C. later this month. Is that the government created this. If y'all remember this little thing called DRGs that started back in the mid-'80s, that was really the genesis of us trying to automate healthcare. And that automation began with what? Billing systems, patient accounting systems, ordering systems, and those type of things. And so the genesis of these machines that we've created and the applications that were created, they were designed to do coding and billing in a limited amount of record keeping. It wasn't until the late 80s and early 90s that we started thinking, hey, our primary objective in healthcare is take care of patients. Why don't we do something clinically with these things? And so we started figuring out that pharmacies were a great place to capture cost data. And so we started automating that, and then it became a patient safety issue. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, our systems that we're using today were designed in a vacuum. They were designed to be siloed systems. Every lab system I have ever worked with, and I used to implement those, they were designed from the ground up. They were kind of like chart of accounts and general ledgers. Everybody has one. There's no standards. There are standard accounting practices, but I doubt very seriously that you could find many ledger accounts that are exactly the same. The same thing goes for ordering catalogs of how things are ordered. I'm an X-ray tech. I can give you about 30 different ways a physician can order a chest X-ray, and that's going to come across a long ways. And so the other thing is, we mentioned the regulation piece, and David, you mentioned this, is one of the things we found with meaningful use, it was a good thing and a bad thing, that's Chuck's opinion, is that it set a threshold that people just had to step over in order to meet it. It was meant to be a floor, but getting to that threshold sucked all the development oxygen out of the air. And so the EHR vendors were madly trying to marshal their resources in order to meet those standards because they knew good and well the next ones were right on the horizon. And so it put us into every 24 to 18-month upgrade cycles. It was really great for the EHR vendors and made a lot of people wealthy doing that, but it didn't leave a lot of room for time for innovation. And so now we've slowed that train down a little bit, and so we have an opportunity to innovate. And FHIR is a great platform to do that. So I'm going to share with you one of the things we've done with IU Health. We spend a lot of time talking to the physicians. Some of you may or may not be familiar with the Regenstrief Institute, which is applied informatics. They have some really, really smart physician, MD, PhDs, and some other Ds after their name that I can't pronounce. But we had one young man that came over for a clinical informatics fellowship. He was from Germany, and he asked a question. why can't we present the information to the physician at the point of care before he asks for it? And so we said, okay, I think we can name that tune. I didn't. The team here at IHI with the informatics at Registry and with the clinicians at IU Health. And so what they did is they worked with the ER physicians to say, when a patient walks in the emergency room with a chief complaint of chest pain, what do you look for? And so they came up with a standard list of 5 things that they always want to see. And so what we were able to do, IU Health is a Cerner shop. And so we were able to fire enable Cerner. So when the system saw the patient had a chief complaint of chest pain, it looked into our clinical data repository to find those the most current versions of those 5 pieces of information and make it, and it shows up on the left-hand side of the screen for the physician. If there's data, it lights up. If there's no data, it stays grayed out. And so Dr. Jason Schaefer was one of the ER physicians. He's also one of the CMIOs at IU Health. He was, I want to say one of our investigators, but he truly was a guinea pig, and he was a champion for this as well. They had a patient come in one night, and he noticed that all 5 pieces of information lit up, but they all came from the Cerner instance because we showed them where the data came from. And so as the other physicians were taking care of the patient because it was their patient, he says, well, I wonder how long it will take me to find this information in the Cerner instance. And so he went and looked it up. It took him about 4.5 minutes to find all 5 pieces of information, and he knows how to navigate the Cerner instance very well. So he went back to the FHIR app, and it took him 12 seconds to look at all 5 pieces of information within their own EMR, but it was sitting in our clinical data repository. And, I asked Jason, says, what do you think? And his response was, not fast enough. And, I've had one heart attack, and I can tell you, I want them to have the information as fast as they possibly can have it. So we were able to get it down to about half of that. So about 6 seconds after the patient hits the door, gets the chief complaint, we can present that information to the physician. And so that's kind of the tenet that a lot of the physicians are asking all of us in this industry. Is they've said to me in so many different ways, don't tell me what I already know. Don't give me a basket of data, just kind of like Dave said, that I have to wade through and I have to go hunt for it. Tell me what I don't know that's germane to the patient that's sitting in front of me. And so I think that, to me, is our ultimate challenge, to get these machines to where they are an assistant to the physician to present information that is important to them in their clinical decision making. Or it could be important to, a case manager about their patient populations. And so the machines can be smart, and we just need to spend the time with the innovation and the tools that we currently have to make them smarter than they are today.
So do we have enough clinicians engaged in that effort, making the machines smarter? Anyone? I'd be interested in everyone's perspective. Are people engaged in this effort sufficiently?
I can start by sharing our experiences with EHR vendors. Most EHR vendors are still driven by the return on investment of can we produce value for our customers, what's important to them, and what's important for them historically has been revenue cycle management, billing, transactions, what do I get paid for this activity? Clinicians have borne the burden of coding, of meaningful use, of clinical quality measures, etc. If you ask the clinicians what they need, I had maybe 10 years ago, I went to visit a site in one of our very early prototypes, and it was an endocrinologist, and she was on the second floor of a building. So people couldn't look in the windows, which becomes important in a moment. And she was documenting according to the system they then had in place, and it took forever. I mean, you can imagine if it took, 5 minutes to find anything, and then documenting to feed the billing, the E&M bullets, everybody remember those, all that. all of these requirements on the physician at the point of care, but no assistance to them in what they were trying to do, which is diagnose and treat the patient or keep the patient well. So after she did that, she then went and did a plan, wrote a prescription, et cetera, and then she said, now, I'm going to have another patient come in here, and she unplugged the computer, she turned off the lights, she put up the blinds so she could see, and she said, now watch what happens. She pulled out a piece of paper, she had a very similar patient, and she did everything she needed to do with the same outcome for the patient in about 60 seconds of documentation, rather than fumbling with the system, finding this and that. She said, I already knew what to do. I knew what to do within 30 seconds of the patient coming in and saying, you know, here's a little bit of information, and here's what's going on with me. And she said, oh yeah, I remember you. And she said, okay, well, let's renew this, let's do that. And she said, now Dave, which system would you want to use? That one or none? She said, make any system you do as fast as no system at all, by giving me what I need to do so I can just think about the patient, their condition. So present that stuff in 6 seconds is one hell of a good result. But even they go, well, wait a minute, I seem to be waiting forever, because they're already on to the next thing. I mean, they've gone through medical school, they've gone through internship, they've gone through residencies, they've learned to do this. It's almost like mental muscle memory. 95% of the time, they need the system to just not get in their way and not slow them down, because they know what to do. They need the systems to just say, here's the information that you would want, very similar to what you did, Chuck, with the chest pain. Here's the 5 or 6 things I need to get started with this. Just give them to me. Sometimes there's more than 5, sometimes there's 15 or 20, sometimes there's comorbidities, but here, your peers have told, for instance, us in building this, your peers have told us this is what they'd be thinking about this kind of patient, so just present it and then sit back and get out of the way. And figure out a way for the algorithms and intelligence to say, oh yeah, this patient meets these 3 quality measures, you need to also do a fall risk, you need to do this, you need to do that, and put it in front of them so they can do that and then get out of the way. They know what they're doing. Let's assist them instead of slow them down. So we have a ways to go. But
right. So I imagine, right.
Go ahead.
We all hear that from clinicians. The machines should be a little smarter at this point than they are, and hopefully we can add some of that intelligence to these systems. I mean, another aspect of the system improvement that is needed is not only the intelligence but the security of data. As we increase the interoperability of systems, we put at risk the security of the data, and that is often the issue, you know, on which I get called in, data privacy and security, but there are certainly technical fixes or supposed fixes to that, data integrity, data security. People talk about blockchain as a panacea in this department. I'm wondering if any of you has some experience in using tools involving blockchain or something like that, and whether you think blockchain is what we need or something else is what we need in order to ensure better security on the road to interoperability.
Well,
hey,
go ahead, Jitin.
I was going to say, hey, David, if I answer that question, can I also answer the question before? Because I really wanted to answer the question before.
Certainly.
All right, fantastic. So blockchain and clinicians. One thing, so on the clinicians point, really it was a fairly simple point, but it's an important one. There is a difference between clinicians and providers, right? When we talk providers, we talk about provider organizations. Their motivations are different from EHR vendors, technology vendors, but not as different as you would hope. Clinicians have very different wants and needs. They're solely focused on the patient. They want to get paid at the end of the day. That's the business side of a clinical business. For a provider organization, there's the clinical side of a business that they're trying to run. And what you'll find is that in things like in advisory committees at the federal level, in organizations like CommonWell, Carry Quality, and EHR vendors who have their own councils, you'll find a mix of clinicians and providers, usually more biased to providers. The sales all happen to provider organizations, not to clinicians, at least not in the sort of the large space. So when you say, do you have a provider or a clinician present, those two are actually very different things. And I do think clinicians are underrepresented in this picture, largely because it's not what they do. So it's not their fault or anybody else's fault, really. But it is an important distinction, because when we look at things that came out of meaningful use and so on, or if we look at kind of what a conversion to an EHR is driven by, it's not always or even often driven by clinical outcomes. It's driven by payment and billing outcomes, or the need to capture right documentation. So that was my little point on the first topic. In the terms of blockchain, your actual question, we look at it as CommonWell. Obviously, by the time blockchain became a thing, really, CommonWell was already underway. But then there still can be said for FHIR, and we've adopted FHIR whole hog, right? There's no transaction on CommonWell that's not FHIR enabled. But on the blockchain front, one of the things we realized is that when you are dealing with the blockchain, the security and risks and threats are not completely mitigated. They're just different. I mean, presumably we're not running a public healthcare blockchain, or if we are, maybe that's where we should get involved. But if you're running a private one, then you still have to centrally manage things like keys, and you still have just have different areas where there may be trust and security issues, and that's not even looking at the whole problem of getting broad industry adoption. So we've not ourselves kind of grappled with it and decided we're going to run a workshop on blockchain, for instance, or just try to even really dabble with it. But as an exercise of going through technology and evaluating, is that where we should go right now? We decided that not quite yet, but we're keeping an eye on it, because to your point, privacy, security, these are perpetual issues. These are often the issues that lead providers or others, not providers and clinicians and so on, to not actually participate in healthcare data exchange. And they're real issues. And we do think, very thoughtfully about how do we enable the best of those circumstances given the technologies we have.
Well, I mean, and David, I want to congratulate you, because all the people that are listening to this have their tech speak bingo card out, and you use blockchain, and I'm going to use the other one, so maybe somebody get a bingo and say Bitcoin. The thing about it is, and I want to go back, I'm spending time in history today, is one of the things I've noticed over time is we spent so much time, effort, energy, and money about automating healthcare. Healthcare has been really bad. I've been the chief security officer for 3 different organizations now, and we're just now getting to the point of people understanding that you're having to make an investment in security protocols, frameworks. There is a technological component to it, but I don't think that even Bitcoin, or not Bitcoin, but blockchain, is the panacea that everybody thought it was going to be. I mean, I read a security blog every day, and some of the people that actually deal in cyber security, the way that they have their security set up to manage that cyber currency, they're being robbed blind by people that are stealing, having getting their phone cloned, and their hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars taken away from them, because guess what? Our 2-factor authentication is send me the 5-digit number that will unlock my account to my phone. And so these 14-year-olds and 16-year-olds have found out how to do that. The weakest link. And so I believe that, the security is something that's going to be ongoing, because as soon as you think you've got a good lock on your door, the person that wants in is going to get a bigger battering ram, and they're going to find their way in. So we have to be diligent. And I think that that's something that, it worries me a little bit about the APIs, because people know that there's money in this, because now the government's requiring the use of APIs. And I really would like to get a real good definition of what that means. Is it a FHIR API, or is it somebody, Mama Joe's API? because the requirement is that the patient can use any one of their choices as long as it meets the security standards of the EHR, the certified EHR. And so if you look at Google Plus, that one was pretty well locked up, everybody thought, until they figured out it wasn't. Same thing goes for Facebook and a few other things. We've got some pretty high-end cases of where the security, everybody thought it was locked up, but in essence it really wasn't. So we really need to be more cognizant of how quickly we move out there to share data. The other thing bothers me about, there's a HIPAA requirement that if a patient requests their data, you can give it to them, and then your liability and responsibility for that data is gone. There is a Sotomayor actually wrote the Supreme Court brief on this that says if you give your data away, you have no consideration for privacy. You've given it away. You've given your permission to give it to that person. And so once you do, they can do anything with it you want. It bothers me a little bit when we're asking older adult populations like me to freely give away their Medicare claims data for 4 years worth of that to somebody to help them manage their medications without knowing what they're going to, how the secondary use of that information is going to be. So there's a lot of things we need to learn before we just open up the floodgates and connect to everything and share everything.
All right. Now, Dave or Chris, I'd want to bring you into the conversation. As Chuck has alluded to, there's a concern about interoperability. There's also, from a security perspective, there's also a concern from a provider perspective sometimes in terms of sharing, and desire not to overshare. It's my data perspective. Why should I share it with you? And certainly there are more and more information highways being opened up today, but I think just looking at the general press from time to time, we all see situations where individuals are unable to get their own medical data from point A to point B. Do you see this as still being an issue for provider organizations? And do you think that it should be, or are we past that, or should we be past that, where there's seems to be, or in the past there seemed to be a financial interest in not sharing data?
Yeah, I'll start and then I'll let David weigh in too, but from an ONC and from a government perspective, I think the political leaders in Congress and others have been pretty vocal, especially with 21st Century Cures, that competition should not be based on hoarding data. I talked about the data blocking issue. There's going to be part of the rules. There's going to be some discussion about that and about regulating and policing that. But I think the message that's going out from Congress and from others is that that it's no longer acceptable to be using data hoarding as a way to compete, and that there should be other ways that data could be used that have a public interest. And again, there'll be more coming out with TEF and other things that talk about that. But ONC will definitely be involved as far as helping with this. There's the certification process I mentioned before. We will be looking at providers, we'll be looking at EHR vendors to make sure that they also will be transparent in what they're doing, and so that we can get the data from them as well. So multi problem with data hoarding that sometimes happens with the vendors, sometimes it happens with the providers, but it's certainly something that our political leaders have weighed in on, and they're hoping to stop.
Dave, do you see any progress on this front?
I see progress in some of the wishes and the things that 21st Century Cures, some other things, that the technical stuff is coming together, but we still have 50 states and 6 territories, and even if your EHR vendor at a provider organization is willing to open their systems to share the data, the enterprise has to feel comfortable doing it also, pursuant to their own state laws and regulations, et cetera. So I would like to see a suggested national standard for what are the requirements for patient privacy, control of patient data, et cetera, so that there's not 56 different sets of things that people have to worry about, because it gives an organization who has a crosstown rival a good reason to not share the data. They say, well, you know, we need to give it to you in this format because that's the minimum required. If we do any more than that, we risk making it available electronically. It could be hacked, and our attorneys, they always blame it on the attorneys. Our attorneys tell us we've got to be very careful with this. Until there's some sort of consensus on what can we do and stay out of trouble, and what should we not do to get into trouble, uniformly, I think we're still giving provider organizations, if not vendors, an out for still making it available in the least friendly framework they can.
And Dave, I'll violently agree with you on that. One of the things that I took issue with in the first version of the TEF was the fact that it said all these things, then it says within applicable law. And that, to me, that was an out, because that means that if you're going to exchange data between states, California and New York, you have to be able to apply. You have to meet the letter of the law in those states, and it's difficult to do. I mean, if you take some of the large health systems in the country, you take Sutter, Geisinger, Tenet, Ascension, that are in many different states. They have organizations there. They have to juggle not only a variety of EHR systems that are all certified, but they still have to meet the state requirements and laws that are in there. So I would agree that if we can come up with, look, I'm the last guy that anybody that I know that would believe to say come up with a national law about certain things, because I grew up in the South, so I'm a states' rights kind of guy. Is that that's if we're going to truly have interoperability that is going to create a place that people can safely do it without inadvertently tripping up something on a state statute, that there is no attorney that I'm aware of that can understand the consent and privacy laws of all 50 states and 6 territories. It's just not possible because they're changing all the time. California just wrote a whole other set that kind of mirrors the European rules. And I believe that we're going to see that kind of permeate through the rest of the United States over time.
Yeah, this is Chris. We certainly recognize from a federal perspective that issue. That can only be remedied by some kind of legislation that gets passed. And I don't know if there, especially under this administration, if there's an appetite for state preemption or preemption of state laws. But certainly we definitely understand that that's an issue. We've had contracts with the National Governors Association and others to help us, try to come to some consensus, or at least understand where all the differences are. So at least we can try to navigate through all of that. But it is, you're exactly right. That's a huge issue.
I mean, just the ability to be able to report on acting.
Falls into the.
Oops. Sorry, I just see the ability to report on behaviors and understand to what extent they fall within, data blocking or not is really helpful, right? I mean, that's one of the issues that we have, because you could, to Dave and I think to Chuck's point, there are all sorts of loopholes. Your lawyers can again blame it on your lawyers. That we couldn't exchange data because blah 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 blah. Or it was one person said bluntly during a discussion last week. Yeah, we just blame it on HIPAA. Yeah, HIPAA is true. It prevents it. It's just not true. We know that it's not true. But at the same time, you see that again and again. I remember when we started the alliance, I had a discussion with 2 EHR vendors who decided not to join the alliance because they made all their money off of interface fees, and they thought that this was disruptive to it. I'd be happy to report those 2 vendors 3 years later are actually involved in either CommonWell or Carrier Quality, and so they clearly realized that the world has shifted. But on the provider organizations, I still see tremendous variability. Organizations say, yep, obviously we need to be doing this everywhere. It's work and all that, but we have to do it. And then other organizations who are, we're not touching this with a 10-foot pole. It's just not, it reeks of giving away the farm. We're not going to participate. And then there are others smack in the middle who say, we'll go live in some places, not live in other places, because that guy that down the road in that community, he doesn't play nice. But those guys on that other road and that other community, yeah, they play with us all the time. So we're happy to share in that community. It is still too variable, and we need some way to be able to kind of let everybody know what the gold standard for exchange should be, or the minimal standard, really, for being able to connect should be.
I mean, and the thing about it is, I think we have a tendency, those of us who live in this technology world, we have a tendency to blame everything on technology. We blame HIPAA, we blame the government, we blame regulations, but at the end of the day, many times it's a process. I had a meeting with a CEO of a small hospital here in Indiana yesterday, and he said one of the biggest troubles is that they their primary care physicians refer patients to the larger populous areas for specialty care, and once that evaluation or other stuff is done, the primary care doctor doesn't get anything back, and so they're having to make phone calls and other things. To me, there's got to be a process in place to, kind of load that document up so it'll go to wherever it needs to be, versus just thinking the system's just going to take care of it for you. So I don't think we've nailed down all the processes and procedures and all the things we do just for the kind of the basics. We're wanting to hit a home run. To use a class analogy, is we need to do some singles and doubles. And take care of some of the basis premises of taking care of patients. So we're not dealing with populations. We're worrying about somebody's mom who's having a scan next week and making sure that scan gets back. I mean, my mother, before she passed, was having some pretty serious studies done, and it was weeks before she would hear from her physician. And it wasn't typically until one of her sons picked up the phone and called and said, well, what's the deal? So it's those kind of process things we need to work on, as well as the technologies.
That's right. And thanks, Chuck, for bringing it back to the human level. That's really what we're all the problem that we're all trying to solve ultimately is a human communication problem. We have standards, we have technology, we're working towards greater interoperability, and it sounds like we're inching along. I like the analogy to hitting some singles and doubles, and we don't necessarily have to go for the fences every time out. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you very much.